Thank you. For at least 40 years, social science research has been confirming what the experience that is so common among us, that we can each think of an individual teacher that made a huge difference in our lives. And the people like Jonah Rockoff and I, who've been looking at student achievement gains, have seen that reflected in the data, that you'll see that there are some teachers who get much larger achievement gains in the typical year than other teachers. And yet, we know amazingly little about what it is that the terrifically effective teachers are doing. And so this Measures of Effective Teaching project that I've been running for the Gates Foundation started with a very simple, almost simplistic question, and that was, could we start with the ideas that people have about what effective teaching looks like, and try to measure it in a number of different ways, and then see if any of those measures are related to student achievement gains. So now, what John talked about this morning in implementing the Common Core standards is clearly a massive adult behavior change exercise, that we're not going to see dramatic gains in student achievement unless we see dramatic changes in instruction. I mean, it's just an obvious point to start, but it has powerful implications, because adult behavior change is very hard work, and we know that it's not going to happen without meaningful feedback. So one way to think about the work that we've done so far is that we have just taken the first modest step of saying, okay, how could you try to measure effectiveness? And I'll talk a bit about that this morning. What are some of the challenges? What have we learned so far about different measures of effectiveness? But I want to close by talking about our initial hypotheses about how you might move to the next step from just measuring effectiveness to trying to drive changes in practice, which is the much harder work that's still in front of us. Now, when we went about trying to look for alternative measures of effectiveness, there are only so many places you could turn. And so we looked at 4 different categories of measures. One was, obviously, you needed some way to observe in the classroom, but you also needed to have some systematic way of observing. It can't just be all about subjective impressions, because even if subjective impressions are predictive, you can't coach people around subjective impressions. You need to be able to identify specific practices and specific things that you could train observers to look for, and you could train principals to look for, and you could train teachers to do. So we collected video in 3,000 teachers' classrooms and scored it using a number of different approaches to doing classroom observations. The second place we looked was student surveys. So this is the way I get evaluated every semester. And so we wanted to know, could students in K-12 do the same thing that students throughout higher education do, and that is provide feedback on the quality of instruction in their classrooms. The third type of measure that we tested was a test of pedagogical content knowledge. So The knowledge required for teaching is related to content knowledge, but it's different. So I might know how to divide fractions myself, but in order to teach, I need to know more than that. I need to know what are the most common ways in which people will misunderstand dividing fractions. I need to be able to recognize what are some really powerful examples for illustrating the problem of dividing fractions. I challenge you to think about that, actually. It's harder than you think. And so that's knowledge that could be tested. So the Gates Foundation had a contract with ETS to try to develop an assessment of pedagogical content knowledge. And then the fourth area that we measured was student achievement gains, trying to, as measured on the state test, but we also supplemented the assessments of student achievement gains on the state test with some assessments that probe students' conceptual understanding in math and in English language arts that required kids to do some writing. So I'm just going to quickly summarize 4 of the lessons learned from that work so far, and then I'll talk about what are the next steps that we're working on. The first lesson was actually the current assessments of pedagogical content knowledge were not related to effectiveness. So I point this out because there's a great interest these days in developing a bar exam for teaching. And conceptually, that makes sense. But the evidentiary standard should be, okay, well, shouldn't it be that performance on this bar exam is at least related to effectiveness later? And all of the measures that we've tested so far have not been related to student achievement later. Actually, that's been one of the more puzzling findings in all of this work, and actually runs counter to a lot of people's intuition. This is related to the evidence on that Teach for America teachers, while the evidence suggests maybe are slightly more effective than similar novice teachers, at least in math, and not actually in English language arts. Yet there are huge differences in effectiveness among Teach for America Corps members and among traditionally certified teachers. So even there, even though Teach for America teachers have attended institutions that are, where content knowledge would presumably be much higher, the evidence suggests there's very small differences. So that's consistent with what we've been seeing so far, is that the assessment of content knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge are weakly related, often unrelated, to students' achievement gains later. A second thing that we learned was that even with careful training, classroom observations, in order to be reliable, require more than one observer per teacher. So now, to get a sense of this, I just will provide you with some of the language from one of the more common approaches to classroom observation, the Danielson framework. And in this call-out box, I've just called out the specific language for one of the standards from the Danielson instrument that focuses on classroom instruction, and it's one focusing on using questioning and discussion techniques. So a teacher will get an unsatisfactory score in questioning and discussion techniques if he or she asks a bunch of yes/no questions in rapid succession and just has questions that involve a small number of students in the class. A teacher will get an advanced score on that instrument if he or she asks questions that require kids to explain their understanding of something. And involves other students in the class and has students ask each other some of the questions. So that's pretty clear. You could imagine walking into a classroom and have a easy time, or fairly straight, it should be easy to identify the unsatisfactory from the advanced. The problem is in the middle. There's a lot of gray area in these observational instruments. So a teacher will get a basic, some questions ask for explanations, and if there are uneven attempts to involve all the students in the class, and a teacher is supposed to get a proficient if most of the questions ask for explanation. So you can just see from the language in these instruments that there's going to be a tremendous amount of judgment involved in any of these classroom observations. I'd argue that that will inevitably be true because the things that can be measured with 100% reliability are probably the things that don't matter so much. So, like, is the teacher wearing a tie? Well, my guess is if I were wearing a bolo tie, that might raise some uncertainty in some people's minds. But that'll be the kind of measure where you could train people to recognize a tie, and you could develop a common understanding of what a tie looks like. I see Joe's wearing a bow tie. I guess we would count that. But that kind of thing is probably not all that related to student achievement gains. The thing that would be related to student achievement gains would be this kind of thing. What's the quality of the teacher's questioning technique? Well, if you're going to include that in your classroom observation, which I'd argue you'd have to, rather than focus on the things that are trivial, you're going to need to be prepared for the fact that not everybody's going to agree. Well, one of the things that we learned is that that you can still achieve high reliability or moderately high reliability, but it requires multiple observations and more than one observer. So in here in this chart, I'm just showing what's the gain in reliability on the Danielson instrument when you go from one observation to two observations with the same observer. So if you just add an observation by another observer, you raise the reliability from 0.51 to 0.58. The second bar says, okay, well, what happens if you don't just add another observer, you don't just add another observation, you have that second observation done by a different person? Well, the gain in reliability is more than twice as large. That rather than rising from 0.51 to 0.58, you rise from 0.51 to 0.67. So the increase of 0.16 rather than 0.07. Now, that doesn't necessarily require huge increases in the total amount of observation. Right now, in many schools, a principal will be responsible for one set of teachers, and an assistant principal or a department head might be responsible for another set of teachers. Well, you could generate increases in reliability just by having people play tag team and share the observational responsibilities for the same teachers. And we had just played out a number of different approaches to observation. If I could get this slide to work. Yeah, let's see. There we go. So there are different ways you could do this, but they all involve more than one observer for trying to achieve reliability in classroom observations. Unfortunately, a lot of schools are not doing that. There's just a single observer doing the observation. A third finding from the study was that the student surveys were actually related to a teacher's student achievement gains. Often, actually, the correlation was slightly higher from the student surveys with student than the classroom observation. And it was, the student surveys were among the most reliable of the measures that we tested, in the sense that they were less likely to bounce around from year to year or classroom to classroom. Now, once you think about it, actually this makes a lot of sense, even though when we started the project, this wasn't something that we were predicting. And that is that even if the typical student is not nearly as discerning as a trained adult, you get to average over 25 students in an elementary class or 75 or 100 students in middle schools, whereas you might be able to average over 1 or 2 adult observers. So the power of averaging really helps. Plus, we had seen, I didn't emphasize it earlier, but there is variation in a teacher's practice from lesson to lesson. John King gave an example of having a particularly attentive or a particularly unruly student in the front row could potentially make a difference for how a teacher's classroom observation goes. It would also matter what type of content they're teaching that day. So there's certainly some days where if you walked into my classroom where I'm teaching primarily methodological content, I would not score well on the questioning skill, because I'm not asking, we're not having a discussion, and the students are not asking each other's questions. They might be asking me questions, they might be asking the teaching fellow after class questions, but they're rarely asking each other questions that day. So a teacher's score on a classroom observation instrument might vary with the content they provide. Well, the students are there for 180 days. They're not there for 2 or 3 days on a classroom observation. So students are getting to average over a much larger number of instances. So for both of those reasons, the reliability for the student surveys was among the highest of the measures that we tested. And here's just, I'll show you some of these, the specific wording from the questions. So the numbers here, the percent of students agreeing at the 25th and at the 75th percentile. So a quarter of students in our study were in classrooms where less than 36% of students agreed with the statement, "Our class stays busy and doesn't waste time." And another quarter of students were in classrooms where more than 69% of students agreed with questions like that. Other questions that were particularly related to student achievement gains. In this class, we learned to correct our mistakes. In a quarter of classrooms, fewer than 56% of kids agreed with statements like that. In another quarter of classrooms, more than 83% of kids agreed with statements like that. So the students' agreement on questions like this, not a popularity contest. These are questions that are focusing on particular aspects of practice. Students' responses on questions like this were related to a teacher's student achievement gains when working with another group of students. So it wasn't just that they were particularly happy or particularly grumpy students saw big gains. It was, if you measure a teacher's practice with one group of kids, could that measure predict his or her students' achievement growth in another classroom taught by the same teacher but a different group of kids? Okay, a third or a fourth finding that in some ways was maybe the most important of all of them was that the teachers identified as more effective actually caused students to learn more. Now, I get to use the word cause here because in the second year of the study, we randomly assigned students and teachers to classrooms. Now, why did we do that? Well, we often have people correctly raise the question, okay, you've controlled for baseline test scores of students, or you can try to control for English language learner status and so forth, but as in the example that John described, you can't control for everything. So it could be that the teachers that have large student achievement gains just have students that are particularly motivated or particularly engaged. Now, if we're not measuring motivation and measuring engagement, in fact, it's hard to imagine how we would to satisfy a skeptic. If we're not measuring those things, it could be that we think we're identifying effective teachers, but all we're doing is identifying teachers with exceptional students. The only way to resolve that question, ultimately, is to randomly assign students. So that's what we did in the second year of the study. Teachers had signed up for the study within a particular grade level and subject, so they had to have at least 3 people in a grade level and subject in school to sign up. And so in the second year of the study, we said, all right, let's have the principal, draw up the classroom rosters in the usual way, or if it's in a middle school or or high school, let's have students sign up for classes in the way they normally would. But then, rather than assign a teacher to that classroom of students, we asked the schools to send those rosters to one of our contractors, the RAND Corporation, who then randomly assigned the rosters to teachers. And then we looked at achievement afterwards. So basically, teachers were drawing straws within a school subject and grade level to determine which classroom they taught. And we knew from the first year what was their measured effectiveness. So what was their effectiveness that we measured when classrooms were assigned the usual way? So it wasn't that we're proposing that random assignment is the way to assign students to class. That's not what we're proposing. We recognize that students are assigned to particular teachers for all sorts of reasons, but we wanted to know is if you measure effectiveness in classrooms as they are assigned as part of the usual life of a school, can you discern effective teaching practice, or will it just be impossible to see recognize great teaching? Will you inevitably be distracted by the exceptional students? So that was the test that we did, and along the x-axis here is we just sorted teachers into 20 different groups based on their predicted effectiveness. On the y-axis is their achievement following their students' achievement following random assignment. The dashed line is not the fitted line, although actually the fitted line would be right on top of it. The dashed line there is what happens if predicted achievement were equal to actual achievement. And what this suggests is that on average, we were right, that the measures could identify the teachers who were more effective and teachers who were less effective. Now, when I say on average, that's important because within each of these 20 different groups, there's a lot of variation. So there'll be some teachers that had results that were a lot better than predicted, and there were some teachers that had results that were a lot worse than predicted. But what this suggests is, on average, if you use these measures, combining student achievement gains, student surveys, and classroom observations, you can identify differences in practice, which will turn out to not just, be correlated with what happens later, but that could, predicts the differences in achievement that you'd expect later. So it wasn't just that the direction of the effect was in the right direction, it was the magnitude of the predicted effect was right on average. That was in math. In English language arts, the relationship was a little bit flatter. So if you just look at in English language arts, rather than getting a coefficient of 0.955, where 1 means that the actual achievement equal predicted achievement, in English language arts, the coefficient is 0.7, which means that the differences in achievement are about 70% as large as you would have predicted. But still, you know a lot from a classroom observation and student achievement gains and student surveys. Now, all I've described here, by the way, is the equivalent of a bathroom scale. And if you're going to try to do a massive behavior change exercise, you need to know more than that. You need to know how to design the Weight Watchers program. You need to know, what does the rest of the system look like in order to drive the behavior change. So the measure is a critical part, because just imagine trying to, engage in a massive weight loss program without a bathroom scale. So a measure is an important part, but it's not enough. We have to understand the rest of the behavior change problem. So here's a project that we're working on now, and actually I saw on the list there were going to be some folks from Relay Graduate School of Education. Is anybody here from Relay? Oh, well, we're doing this jointly with Relay. That's why I was mentioning that we're at least piloting with them this year, and Charlotte Mecklenburg in North Carolina and Fulton County, Georgia. But what we're trying to do is identify a way in which classroom observations can be done with digital video. There's so many potential advantages to using digital video. For one, it's likely to be much more valuable for a teacher to sit down and watch himself or herself teach rather than read through someone's notes. Because usually the challenge for a teacher who's struggling is that they're not noticing things that they're doing in the classroom, or they're not noticing students' reaction. And you're not going to get somebody to notice something that they didn't notice in the classroom just by showing them your notes of what happened in the classroom. You need to be able to show them themselves so that they can see and try to recognize what they were doing and what they might do differently. A second potential advantage of the digital video is that it makes it easier for principals to time shift. So I often point out that my wife and I no longer ever watch Saturday Night Live anymore. If we do watch it, we have it on the DVR, so we get to watch it during other times of the day or week when we can actually enjoy it rather than dreading waking up the next day and having two rambunctious boys to deal with. A third potential advantage to digital video is it makes it easier to get people from outside the school involved in a classroom observation. One of the things that we can't underestimate, one of the challenges that we can't underestimate is that in a school where a principal has been rating teachers as satisfactory for the last 10 years, it's very difficult to say suddenly, oh, actually you were ineffective, or maybe you need improvement. That's a tough transition to make. So now that gets easier if there are other people involved in the the observation. Just makes it easier for people to have an honest conversation when there's at least one party that has been part of the evaluation who has no personal axe to grind, either positive or negative. Now, we've been using this trick in higher education for years. That what we do is when we have a junior professor who's up for tenure, we send their stuff out for external review. Now, we do that not because we don't know whether the work is high quality or not. Rather, we do it because it makes it much easier for us to have an honest conversation. So well, or at least a semi-honest conversation. I often say I've never walked up to one of my junior colleagues and said, "I think your work is uninteresting. I think you have not produced any breakthrough in our thinking. I'm not sure why you've been doing what you're doing for the last 6 years." I've never said that, I've thought it. But I have said, we sent your stuff out for external review, and the letter writers thought that there was a lack of originality, there was a lack of the breakthrough. And so let's have a conversation about how I might be able to help you in your next job, because we can't put this in front of the president's office or the provost's office. So just having that external review makes it easier for normal people to do courageous things. And a final thing that having the videos available for is it just makes it easier for teachers to collaborate with one another. So if we have to schedule the school day so that each teacher has time to sit in on each of their colleagues' classes, we're going to have a whole bunch of open slots in the school day. But if instead teachers can share their videos and discuss their videos when they're not standing in front of a classroom, it can make for a much more productive discussion. Now, you guys know and I know that in the current environment, if we were to walk in and say, "We got this great idea, stick a camera in your classroom," you're unlikely to get very, very far in New York City or most other districts. And so we're trying something right now that we're calling the Best Foot Forward project. And actually, I think it's not just one way, it may be the only way in which we would get to see the benefits of video in the classroom. So the way it would work is that we would give teachers a fairly low-cost camera. So this camera, by the way, you could buy in Costco. In the Met project, we used a pretty complicated contraption for capturing 360 degrees in the classroom. And we actually had two video cameras, one that was the 360 degree and one that was a high resolution camera pointed at the board, until somebody who'd been paying more attention in geometry class pointed out, you don't need 360 degrees if you can put a camera in the corner. So this camera captures about 120 degrees, which in most classrooms would be enough to capture, if you stuck it in the corner, to capture what's going on. And the other thing that's complicated in a classroom is that there are multiple audio sources. So if you just have a mic on the camera, you often won't have good audio from both the teacher and the students. So in our setup that we're testing, that we have wireless mics, one on the teacher, one sitting out in the classroom. And what we're proposing is that teachers would record their own lesson. In fact, once we have this, and because it doesn't require having an adult standing in the classroom, we're thinking, well, rather than do it just 2 or 3 times a year, how about if we say, in order to be part of this, you have to collect one lesson at least every 2 weeks. And then, but you only submit a subset of them. So you submit 5 lessons over the course of the year. We'll send 3 to your principal, and we'll train your principal to watch these videos and sit down and have a conversation with you about it. And we'll send 2 to a content expert with specific knowledge of your whatever the subject or grade level is. Second, providing feedback is a skill in and of itself. And as I already revealed, I'm not very good at giving my junior colleagues feedback. So I think what we're going to be trying to do is provide observers, it's part of this experiment, with training on how to use video for feedback. Now, one of the challenges is not just being able to describe what somebody's strengths and weaknesses were in the video, but to be able to offer some suggestions for what somebody might do differently. Now, this is an area where we need to make a lot more progress. Actually, probably the most important work that's been done on the generating discrete, coachable changes in practice was done by John's colleague, Doug Lemov. Now, the moves in Teach Like a Champion are small enough to fit inside our constrained working memory. You know, so like when you're learning to dance, you know, I'm sure I still hear people at weddings counting the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 when they're doing a waltz. Well, it's teaching, if you tried, is a very complicated set of behaviors. And in order for me to practice and get better at something, I can't hold that all of the considerations in effective teaching in my working memory at once as I try to act it out. And I can only keep a small little piece of it. But so somebody needs to do the hard work of identifying what some of those discrete pieces are, so that you could then use that as part of the feedback process. So we're going to start out trying to use Lemov's moves, but hopefully other people will be developing our collective vocabulary around these moves in the coming years. One way to, I mentioned dancing, but anybody who's ever played elementary school or high school basketball knows that there is set, you know, if I'd taken my child to a game to watch, you know, Michael Jordan play or another NBA star, or LeBron James, yeah, I guess more, or Larry Bird, since I'm from Boston, it would be, there's so much going on the court that's just telling somebody just play like LeBron or just play like Michael is just a non-starter. But instead we break it down. We say, okay, here's a bounce pass. There's this there's a little move called a pick and roll. There's the give and go. There are all these little pieces that we break a very complicated behavior down to a small set of behaviors that we can train people on, and then we let people use their own creativity and put it together in whatever way they can do. So, you know, LeBron James and I'm sure were taught very similar moves when we were in third grade, but he's been able to use them more effectively than I have. Okay, so this is one challenge. a third thing is that we're thinking, okay, now that we've done this, we need to create the software to make it easier for teachers to share videos with one another. And finally, we're going to be building in multiple rounds of student feedback over the course of the year. Now, one of the challenges in feedback is that in order for feedback to be helpful, it requires frequency. Otherwise, it's just about accountability. So here's an example or an analogy to think about that. Imagine if, so how many people here, I guess I won't ask for people to raise hands, but I imagine a lot of people here have been to a gym recently. And if you're on an elliptical machine at the gym, there are a bunch of gauges for you to look at there while you're sweating. You know, there's a gauge that counts the amount of time spent. There's a gauge that'll tell you how many calories you've burned. There's a gauge that'll tell you how hard you're working. There's a measure of resistance. Well, all of that, all of those measures are helpful in keeping you engaged in the exercise. And to see that, imagine that we only sent you, we put black tape over all of those gauges, and we sent you a letter once a year telling you what was your total amount of time spent on the elliptical and what was your total calories burned. I know I would spend a lot less time on the elliptical. I would not be sweating that last 5 minutes thinking, God, I can't wait till this is over. I would have just gotten off. But there's something about the immediacy of the feedback that is critical for the behavior change. And we're not going to get that if we only do student surveys once a year. So that's another part of what we're trying to build in here, is to have multiple rounds of the student feedback over the course of the year. So hopefully teachers will have the very empowering sense when they see some of those measures move. So if your students are saying that they don't get useful feedback that helps them improve, or if the students are not saying that they learn to correct their mistakes in your class, and you change and you see those numbers move up, that is the kind of empowering experience that, again, would be required of any sort, if we thought of this as a behavior change exercise. One other secret power that we're hoping that the student surveys have, and I wonder if Jonah, who teaches here at Columbia Business School, or Jim Liebman, who teaches at the Columbia Law School, and Ray from Columbia Business School probably have similar experiences, where there is an emotional salience in the student feedback that is not present in most of the other measures. So just imagine, just try to imagine a system where a teacher is struggling and he or she gets a poor classroom observation. There's a lot that I could use to rationalize that. I could say, well, I'm a math teacher, and my principal's a former phys ed teacher. What do they know about math? And suppose then I also have poor student achievement gain measures. I can say, well, gosh, there's a lot I've read in the newspaper that will tell me to ignore these poor student achievement gain results. And if you stop there, you've bred alienation. You've not bred motivation and engagement and focus on improvement. But the student surveys, it's harder to shrug off. It's harder, there'll always be 2 or 3 students that will take a cheap shot. but the average student, particularly if you're doing it anonymously, will be trying to be honest with you, because after all, they want to be engaged in class as well. And so we're going to see, particularly because that's a relatively low-cost thing to do, we're going to see whether doing that multiple times over the year will lead to achievement gains. So for 40 years, we've known that that teaching practice differs. And we're just getting around to taking that result seriously. So for 40 years we've known it, and yet for those same 40 years, classroom observations were perfunctory. We weren't using student achievement gains for individual teachers. We certainly weren't doing student surveys in elementary and secondary education. And so we've got a tremendous amount of ground to make up. And that is important for understanding the pace with which John and others are trying to move. Is it's not that we've suddenly decided teacher evaluation or teachers were important. It was that we've known for 40 years that individual teachers matter a lot, and we're finally taking it seriously. And we shouldn't be surprised that it's going to take us a little time to catch up, for our language and our ability to parse effective teaching to become much more sophisticated than it is now, for the kinds of supports that we give to become higher quality, for principals to learn to take this feedback and development responsibility seriously. So it's going to be hard, but I can't imagine any way we're going to make progress without figuring out how to solve these problems. Okay, so I can take a few questions.
Does the age of the student correlate with reliability?
So, so when we started the study, my older boy was in 4th grade. And so I was skeptical about whether or not these measures would work down to 4th grade. So we tested it. And surprisingly, the correlation, the wording of the surveys were a little bit different in elementary grades than middle school and high school grades, but the relationship to student achievement gains was about the same, and the reliability was about the same. So my son is probably unusual, because I wasn't even sure he knew the gender of his teacher. Still not.
Some of these instruments, not just as a point in time that you're then correlating to whether or not students achieve, but as a pre and a post. Because I know, for example, like Angela Duckworth has done a lot of work on a really great set of items that test for grit. But if you ask Angela Duckworth, can you use that as a pre and a post to try to prove change, she'll say, oh, no, you can't use it as pre and post. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that challenge.
So the classroom any of these measures will have a harder time measuring change than measuring a level. Now we know that that the teachers with higher classroom observations with one group of students have higher value added or student achievement gains than another group of students. But we have not in this study, tested whether changes in a teacher's practice as measured by these instruments are related to changes in his or her students' achievement over time. So we didn't test that in the MET project. There was a study of that in Cincinnati that looked at this, but actually one of the puzzling things here is that I'll just describe a puzzle, like this aspect of this that I've noticed that I can't resolve at this point, but it is something I'm curious about and hope to learn more about in this Best Foot Forward project, is that, John King mentioned this study in Cincinnati which looked at, what happens to a teacher's subsequent student achievement gains when we provide feedback based on a Danielson instrument while they're in the classroom. There was no student survey in that, and actually there was no value-added measure in that. It was just the classroom observation based on the Danielson instrument. Now, the magnitude of achievement gain that they got was far larger than you would have predicted just based on the cross-sectional relationship between the behaviors measured on the Danielson instrument and student achievement among students. So one possibility is that by providing feedback to a teacher on this small set of characteristics that we can measure, or small set of behaviors that we can measure, produces more global changes in behavior that have even bigger impacts on student achievement than you would have predicted based just on the cross-sectional relationship. That's just speculation as to why we see this anomaly, that you saw even bigger gains than you'd predict. But it's an area we need to learn more about in the coming years.
If the question on the camera, if the teacher's controlling the on-off button, how do you ensure that it's an authentic observation as opposed to performance? And if they don't control the on-off switch, how do you prevent it from feeling like the panopticon where you're constantly being watched by this faceless entity?
Yeah. So I've been using the word panopticon a lot lately. I'm really happy that you're using that analogy too. But it's an obvious question, but here was something that we learned in the MET project. I didn't talk about this result here, but it's interesting. It's part of the reason why we've designed this Best Foot Forward the way we have. So we wanted to test in the MET project whether principals and peer observers could score their own teachers reliably. And so we had teachers in Hillsborough County, Florida, who had collected a large number of videos, where we said, okay, we'd like to have your principal score these videos. And they said, well, okay, you didn't warn us about that when we first signed our consent forms, which is true. But they said, okay, so we'll let you do it, but under the following condition, where we get to pick which videos our principals see. We said, okay, fine, as long as the peers get to see any of your videos. So we could get the peers to watch the videos that teachers submitted, and got the peers could also watch the videos that they didn't submit. Now, of course, we didn't tell the peers which videos that were teacher-chosen videos and which videos were not chosen by the teacher to submit. So we could learn something about how was a teacher's practice different in the videos that they were willing to submit to their principal versus the videos where they didn't submit it to the teacher. And here's what we learned. So one, there was a big difference in the mean score, which is a good thing, right? That means that teachers understand the instrument well enough to know which lessons are better than other lessons. It would have been bad if there were no difference in performance in the chosen versus the unchosen videos. But second, we learned that once you adjusted for measurement error, the correlation between a teacher's chosen and unchosen videos was 1. So what that means is that the best lesson from the best teacher is that much better than the best lesson from the weakest teacher. And that the teachers who perform particularly well on their unchosen videos are performing particularly well on their chosen videos. So by giving teachers the choice to submit the videos, yes, you're having a big impact on the mean score, but you're not giving up the ability to recognize who's struggling and who's not. And so, so the element of surprise, which has produced so much anxiety, may not be worth it as long as you've got a way as long as everybody's being treated similarly. It would create inequities if some teachers got to choose and other teachers didn't get to choose, unless you were subtracting, points for the chosen videos. But if everybody's choosing, it doesn't become harder. Actually, the reliability was a little bit higher in the chosen videos. Yes.
I want to shift a little bit to educator preparation. Thank you. So this morning, Commissioner Kane talked a little bit about what we're doing in New York to try and also reform our higher education systems. So as I'm listening to your remarks this morning, and I just came back from a multi-state meeting of northeastern states, really trying to figure out how do we know which teachers are best prepared for entry into our schools and classrooms. I guess I'm wondering, from the research you've done, is there anything currently underway or planned to better understand the preparation of those more effective teachers that could then inform the work that we're doing in higher ed? So we're all talking about clinically rich practice. We're trying to figure out if there should be a higher entry point for GPA. We're trying to figure out if we should have common cut scores, higher cut scores. We're trying to figure out if we should have deeper, longer, more meaningful student-teacher placement. So from a teacher preparation standpoint, what can we learn from the research that you're doing here?
So a couple of things. So I was part of a study in Boston where we looked at the Boston teacher residency program. So we know that clinical experience matters in developing your teaching skill. How do we know that? Well, we know it because everywhere that anybody has done these kinds of studies has found that a teacher's effectiveness rises from their first year of teaching to their second, to their third or fourth, and then there's some dispute about whether it stops after 3 or 4, but there's no dispute in fact about the growth during the first 3 years of teaching. And in fact, there's very little dispute about the magnitude of the growth, that everybody finds about the same increase in student achievement. So we know clinical experience, learning on the job, standing in front of students is one way that people get better at teaching. We know that. And by the way, because of that same evidence, we know that it's not just that, you either know how to teach or you don't know how to teach. It's a skill that you develop over time. Now that said, I don't think we've learned how to replicate that in a pre-service program yet. So in the Boston teacher residency, teacher residency is a very expensive way to do teacher training. If you're going to pay pay an adult a salary for a year to be in a classroom shadowing another teacher, that's expensive. That's and so what? So at the least, you'd expect that when somebody finishes a residency and starts teaching, that that they would come in looking like a second or third year teacher rather than a first year teacher. And there was one estimate in our table that offered some hope that, oh, by the third year of teaching, the residents were a little bit more effective than the traditionally certified teacher. But that actually depended on, that was one small cohort of residents that were part of that program. Most of our estimates suggested during the first 2 years the residents weren't better than the traditionally certified teachers who had not been through that
But in
kind of
the
training.
network, are the more effective teachers, is there any characteristic or profile of those teachers that you've been able to compile?
So, there's sets of practices that we know, and so I think it would be useful to give teachers more practice during the teaching in the pre-service years, watching themselves teach and viewing it through the lens of one of these instruments. Alejandro had used this panopticon thing, and I never got back to tying that together. So imagine if the only person on the other end of the panopticon was the teacher themselves. So here you often hear people say, I've certainly heard people say, teachers are different on the day the observer's there. Now that's even if the observation is not pre-announced, even if the observer is there sort of unexpectedly. Teaching is different on those days. People often say that. Well, what that implies is that there's a set of behaviors that if I'm paying attention to my teaching, I can actually raise my game. All right, well, unfortunately, we can't afford to send an adult in the back of every classroom every day. Like that, even the Gates Foundation can't afford that. But if you have one of these video cameras, just knowing that you might want to use this lesson, you might want to submit this lesson as one of your lessons, might have an effect on behavior, even if the only person that's going to be watching it is you. So that's one possible mechanism that we're hoping that this Best Foot Forward might have an impact on teaching, is that the camera will be on for 20 some days over the course of the year, rather than just 2 or 3 from when an observer was there. And if during those days you're paying more attention to what you're doing, that might also just show up in student achievement. So Ray wants me to wrap it up, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion today. Thanks.